Welcome to Electronic Warfare 103, also known as Ewar piloting. This ship is the third in a series of classes on Ewar. The first, Ewar 101, covers basic fundamentals of how Ewar works. 102 covered basic ship fitting strategies. This class talks about once you have learnt the skills and you have fitted up your Ewar ship, how do you fly it in a normal PvP engagement with the E-UNI, and how do you fly it in such a way that you stay alive a little bit longer and are hopefully a little bit more effective. So this class assumes that you have an underlying understanding of how Ewar modules work and how Ewar ship fitting works. Perhaps you also have a few experiences in flying as an Ewar pilot in a uni fleet, and you can compare some of these comments to your own experiences. But first, to introduce myself, my name's Miranda Glade. I'm an ex-E-UNI graduate and also an ex-mentor and teacher, as well as ex-captain of the ILN. I left E-UNI to become a director in Noble Sentiments, which is an NBSI PvP corp. You can find us in our public channel, which is called Noble Sentiments. I enjoyed learning about Ewar while in the uni, and I still enjoy learning about it now. We're going to talk a little bit about Ewar common principles to start us off. As I mentioned in Ewar 101, Ewar really has the opportunity to turn the course of a battle or to be a force multiplier. It does rely on the other elements of the fleet, such as tackle, DD, and logistics, but it still is a vital element in many fleets. One of the great things about Ewar is that you are flying totally differently to a lot of the other pilots, so you'll be fighting at a much greater range, and in fact we'll talk about that a little bit right now. So when you take a look at the Ewar modules on your ship, which I encourage you to look at right now if you're sitting in an Ewar cruiser or frigate at the moment, is that your optimal ranges can be something like 25 or 30 kilometers, and then your fall-off ranges can be something like another 50 kilometers. Your optimal plus fall-off can then be around the 75 kilometer mark. And what many people don't realize when they first start working with optimals and fall-offs is that your optimal plus fall-off range still gives you a 50% chance of hitting a target. There is a fantastic graph and related article on a thing called Grismar's Wiki. That's Grismar. He has a wiki page on fall-off, and he talks about how optimal plus fall-off interact, and also how optimal and how things work at twice fall-off or something like that. I really encourage you to take a look, and there's a really good graph which helps you visualize the numbers. The other thing that's important about flying as an Ewar pilot is staying mobile. So because you have to fight at range and fight at your optimal plus fall-off, it means you're moving around a lot more, especially during a defensive gate camp. There are important things about how to stay alive as an Ewar pilot, since you are likely to be made primary before the DD pilots, or often even before the tackle pilots. And finally, the capacitor management tends to be a big issue because you're flying in a Tech 1 cruiser or a Tech 1 frigate. You don't have a lot of cap to play with, especially if you're a Caldari Blackbird pilot. So using your Ewar modules properly is tricky business, especially when you might be competing with other modules, and even when you're not. Finally, if you're trying to use something like Ewar drones, that can be quite challenging, whether to launch the drones or not, and when to recall them and how to use them. So the general advice that I give to all Ewar pilots is, if nothing else, try to remember what I like to call Miranda's 3 partying rules of Ewar. And Miranda's 3 partying rules of Ewar go like this. Number 1, arrive fashionably late. There's absolutely no need for you to arrive on grid early in a fight. You can arrive 5-10 seconds after the fight has started. This allows the enemy to choose their targets, their primary and secondary first, and then you arrive, forcing them to either stick with their original choices or to have to make new decisions about their primaries. As an Ewar pilot, you're most effective once all your friends are on grid and in the fight, which means you really want to wait until the fight has really started, until you start activating your modules anyway, so that means there's no reason for you to show up early. Number 2, hang back from the main crowd. Because you're an Ewar pilot, you can afford to sit out at your optimal plus fall-off range, or even if you like, you can sit out maybe just at your optimal range, which could still be something like 50 kilometers or as much as something like 80 kilometers. 50 to 80 kilometers means that you are a long distance from most of the action, you are probably out of the range of most of the enemy damage dealers, and it also means that the tacklers that the enemy has have to fly a long way to catch you. So at distance from the main battle you are relatively safe, but you are still at your full effectiveness as an Ewar pilot. Number 3, bail when it's no longer fun. Most of the really good Ewar pilots will stay aligned to a Celestial as they're in a PvP engagement, and as soon as they get targeted, let alone shot at, they will immediately warp out to that Celestial. It doesn't mean you don't return to the fight, it just means that you break the lock that the enemy has on you, you disrupt their attention, you make them think that you've disappeared, and then again you fly back to the engagement. At range, so you hang back from the main crowd still, but it means that you have saved yourself and you can then continue to get more Ewar action. It's much more useful for you to fly away and come back than to try and get in an extra jam or maybe an extra cycle and then get tackled and eventually blown up. So, talking more about the concept of mobility, flying in such a way that you're always aligned to a Celestial means that you don't have to worry about the time it takes to align. It means at any point you can just quickly hit the warp out button and then fly away. The problem with using that method is that once you hit align, you have to remember what planet you align to, so that after you finish targeting various enemies and activating your modules on them, you can then click back on the same planet, because if you click on another planet, you'll obviously have to realign all over again. I generally recommend this approach above using something like fitting plates, because fitting plates also slows you down when you have to move around in preparation for a fight, as is the case when you want to set up a defensive gate camp. In a defensive gate camp, as you've probably noticed from some of your Fleet 101 classes, you sit at your optimal ranges, and in your case it'll be probably something like around the 50k mark. That takes a long time to slow bird out to. In fact, it takes a long time even if you've got an afterburner or a micro-warp drive. So very often when you want to set up a gate camp, you'll want to warp out to the nearest Celestial and then bounce and then come back at range to the gate. In fact, using that approach is also useful when you jump into a system where there is a gate camp. Usually you'll want to fight the temptation to start activating your Ewar module straight away because you'll be too close to the battle. And in situations where you jump into a gate camp, you'll normally want to bounce out to a planet, come back at range, and then from there you can safely use your Ewar modules with a smaller chance of getting shot at yourself. Even though you might have something like drones or neuting modules or Nosferatu modules or other offensive modules, you'll have to resist the urge to use them or to come in close to use them and just focus on using your main modules, which are the Ewar modules. In fact, while you're using your Ewar modules, you'll want to be careful how your cap is going. So if you're in a ship such as especially a Blackbird, cap will be a really important consideration for you. So you obviously don't want to keep your micro-warp drive running constantly, not just because it blows up your sig radius, but because it also eats up your cap and then makes it impossible for you to use your modules. In fact, training warp drive navigation helps you reduce the amount of cap lost as a result of warping between objects in space. So when preparing for an engagement, one of the things you also want to consider, apart from making sure that you're getting your modules ready and your capacitor ready, is you'll want to check the optimal and fall off pretty much every time you get in your ship, and just make sure it hasn't changed as a result of modules you might have changed on the ship, or perhaps new skills that you've learned, and then set that as your orbiting range. I usually use optimal plus fall off as my default orbiting range, and then it just gives you something easy to hit just to maintain that orbit range. Remember though that the way the EVE Online piloting system works is that when you hit orbit and whatever range that you hit it at, if you are inside or outside that range, your ship will just move in a straight line towards or away from your target, which means your transversal will suddenly drop to 0, which is not very good. If you are well outside the orbit range that you want to go to, I suggest you manually pilot. That is, double-click in space at an angle towards or away from your target, and then wait until you're close to your desired orbiting range, and then hit the orbit button then. To focus on racial specific Ewar piloting, if you are a tracking disruptor pilot, remember that your modules suffer from stacking penalties, but if you have different scripts, then you can avoid those stacking penalties. So if you have two modules which have no scripts, then the second module will suffer from stacking penalties, but if you put one script in one module and the opposite script in the second module, you activate them both on the same target, you won't get any stacking penalties. You don't have to be an Amar pilot or a bonus chip pilot to use tracking disruption. A lot of solo pilots use it very effectively. Don't forget though that using tracking disruption on something which can easily track you is not very useful. Use it to exploit ships which might have just barely been able to track you in the first place, or alternatively use it on ships which were just barely had you within range. So in that case, switch to using your optimal and fall off disruption instead. The stacking penalties and the ability to split targets and split scripts also applies to remote sensor dampeners. So if you do use remote sensor dampeners, or you're a Celestis or Morlus pilot, then remember that you can use that trick to avoid the stacking penalties. If you're a target painting pilot, remember that unlike the other Ewar types, chances are you will want to focus your target painters on the primary. The other Ewar pilots will want to focus their Ewar across the fleet and spread their Ewar, but the target painters will want to focus on just the primary. In most uni fleets, target painting is not particularly useful because uni fleets tend to be full of frigates and cruisers fighting against battleships and battle cruisers. Finally, we get to ECM. ECM piloting is probably the most challenging. Not only do you have to match up your racial jammers against the ships, for which there is that alphabetic ship list, and there is the ship reference guide to help you, but also using your ECM jamming modules is a little bit more tricky than just hitting activate on all of your modules at once on whichever targets you're interested in. And to do this, you probably want to switch off auto repeat on your ECM jamming modules and activate one module at a time on your designated target. Once you get a successful jam, there's no longer any need to activate another module on them until the end of that cycle. But of course, if you do get an active jam and you are successful, you can stop using your jammers. But if you don't, you just keep activating the next jammer until you do get a successful jam. And this means that you're more likely to have a spare jammer available to you if an extra enemy pops up on grid. In fact, when you are fitting your ECMs, not only do you want to carry a bunch of racial ECMs and obviously avoid the multiracial ECMs, but you may wish to put some in your cargo hold just in case you see some extra targets. In fact, the general advice for the kinds of ships that I think E-UNI still fights against is to try to go with maybe 2 Minmatar jammers, 1 Amar jammer, and 1 Caldari for every group of 4. Very few pirates fly Galente, so it's usually okay to avoid fitting any Galente jammers. As a matter of fact, when it comes to choosing your targets as an ECM pilot, your first choices will probably be the other E-War ships. You will probably want to spread your E-War, so choosing people with a similar starting name, so similar letter of the alphabet to you, may be useful. You may also wish to set up a special communications channel or sub-channel to talk to your other friendly E-War pilots to help coordinate who you jam. Similar things apply to other E-War pilots, so tracking disruptor pilots and remote sensor dampening pilots will also want to spread their E-War. It's not necessary for tracking disruptor pilots to focus on enemy E-War. They will obviously want to focus on enemy tracking disruption or enemy pilots which have turrets. Remote sensor dampening pilots can team up with ECM pilots and effectively work as a tag team pair. That means one of them jams, and then when a jam finishes, until the next jam hits, remote sensor dampening just means that the target takes even longer to acquire another lock. Maybe they never get in a lock at all. But spreading E-War is quite a challenge, and you'll want to practice it by maybe you want to look up different names of different ships and maybe experiment with calling out ship types to a group of people in a channel and seeing which one they choose to jam first, and then you can discuss the results of it afterwards. It's a good game to play. If you become really good at flying E-War, you might like to consider flying an electronic attack ship or an electronic attack frigate. Each race has one of these. The Ewar have the Sentinel, which is a very interesting EAS because it has bonuses also to newts and nosses. The Glade have the Keres, which is very interesting because it also has bonuses to point and scram range. The Minmatar have the Hyena, which is also bonus to webs, and the Caldari have the Kitsune, which is a fantastic ECM ship, even better than the Blackbird. This concludes E-War 103. I hope, if nothing else, then you can recall Miranda's 3 partying rules of E-War, and I hope they help you. They are: arrive fashionably late, hang back from the main crowd, and bail when it's no longer fun. I hope those 3 rules alone can help get you some extra kills as an E-War pilot and help you safe for a little bit longer. This pretty much means that at this point, since you've covered 101, which is basic principles, 102, which is fitting, and 103, which is piloting, you should be more than qualified to go out there and fly as an E-War pilot. E-War 104 talks about counter E-War modules, which is mostly an academic exercise, but it still may be useful in certain PvP scenarios. If you liked this class, or if you have suggestions for improvements, please email me or send me a forum post. My name is Miranda Glade, or you can drop by in the Noble Sentiments public channel and say hi to either myself or one of my court mates.